Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Looks like I have a whole bunch this week, so I'm just going to jump right in and not waste any time. Kelv SYC saw the SCART coupler adapter that I had shown off in a few videos. Anybody watching on video, there is a very prototype looking adapter here covered in tape and crooked. And for the record, the final prototypes are coming in and there involves zero tape and they're not crooked. But anyway, Kelv wanted to know if there were more adapters like that available for things like JP21 to SCART, HD15 to SCART, to basically just adapt the connector, not the signal. And there's a ton of really great open source or freeware stuff out there that you could make your own, but I don't know of a lot of companies selling them. Now, Retro Access sells like a RCA to SCART adapter using their coax cables, which means that you could take that to do component video through SCART. But generally speaking, I think a lot of stores shy away from this stuff because of the support. And that's something that I learned. I knew it was going to be bad with the SCART to DVI adapter, which is now called the SCART cleaner, but I didn't realize how bad it actually was. And let's exclude language barrier for a moment here, because I never blame that for anything. Let's just say, hypothetically speaking, educated English-speaking people are going to these web pages, and there's still like 10% of people thought it was a SCART to digital DVI adapter, even though there's block letters all over the page, all over my pages on it. In the videos that I described them, I made a big deal about this is not an analog to digital converter. This is a connector converter. And there's still tons of support questions from people that don't read at all. They just look at the picture, click buy, and then wonder why they can't use a DVI to HDMI cable to work these things on their TV. So I hope that's not insulting. It's just the way it is. And it's kind of always been the way it is. So I think a lot of stores shy away from these adapters because now, for that $2 they might make on something, they're going to have to spend hours and hours every week just saying, no, as stated many times, this is not a signal changer. This is an adapter changer. So I hate to be negative about this, but it's just the truth. I think that's why many stores shy away from it. And that's why stuff like the SCART coupler, as long as it works properly, I still have to do all the final testing. I think a few stores will pick up on this because at that point, it works fine. The only issue would be is if you don't do proper cable management and you plug it in and you're pulling on it and you break pins. But at that point, that's got to be some serious common sense issues. I can't imagine. Maybe I'm overestimating, but I just couldn't imagine somebody breaking their switch because they yanked on a cable sideways and then trying to contact the manufacturer of the coupler, but who knows, there'll probably be those. So that's something that's really turned into small hobby projects. And there's plenty of stuff that's either completely open source or just freeware. So you're free to make it, even sell it if you want, but there's no design files. And you could kind of make your own for stuff like this. And the advantage of that is if you're spending the time to make your own, you have to know at least a little bit about this stuff. So you understand that you're just changing the connector, not the signal. The downside is, though, there's plenty of people out there that understand exactly what it is that you're trying to do, and they just don't have the time or the tools to make these things. Because don't forget, if you're only interested in making a handful of these things and you have no other interest in modding, you don't want to buy a $50 soldering iron and you don't want to buy all the flux and the tools. At that point, you're spending a couple $100 to make a few adapters. So I completely understand people that just want to buy these things. The other point too, and once again, I'm not trying to be negative or anything, but anytime a store is going to make, a reputable store will make a run of production on something, they're going to do some testing. And while this was kind of my idea that I pestered Tianfeng to make for me, I still need to test it before I'd be comfortable telling anybody to use it. Because while we think everything was routed fine, how do I know that I'm not going to be able to take something like a composite video async from a console that using a shielded SCART cable looks perfect, but using this, maybe there's interference that bleeds through, or maybe there's audio buzz caused by the way the grounds were routed. You don't know until you test it, and you need the right tools to test it. Sure, there's some obvious stuff. If you listen to a recording with headphones and one has a loud buzz and one doesn't, that's pretty obvious. But what about putting it through MD Fourier? And what about using the proper audio recording tools to make sure that you're not measuring the noise in your audio interface, you're measuring the actual noise. And same thing with the video signal. Do you have a good direct RGB capture system where you could go in 100 times zoomed and take a look at, the pixels on Link's face? Do you have an oscilloscope to see if there's ripple added or anything like that? So, while I'm rambling a lot about a question just involving couplers, I did think it was worth giving some background as to why every store that sells retro gaming accessories doesn't have a whole bunch of these. And, the short summary of all of it is it really should be tested thoroughly in many different scenarios before something's put out there. Then somebody's going to take the risk of ordering 100 and having them pre-made, knowing that maybe this isn't something a lot of these people need. Maybe they're going to sit on shelves for a year or two. And then, of course, making sure that you have to deal with support for something that is going to confuse a lot of people. And, even if only 5 out of 100 are confused, that's 5 email exchanges. That's usually more than one email back and forth with somebody, explaining to them, talking to them, dealing with refunds or the threat of refunds or something. And, there's always that. So hopefully that was a not too wordy explanation as to the whole things that involve these kind of hobby projects. And I probably should have just said, yeah, they're available, but open source, so make your own. But I just felt it was, for anybody that listens to these would probably want to know a little bit more as to why there aren't just a run of 100 made. So, also on the other side of things, if you see the same person putting up a few different designs, maybe tweet them and say, hey, do you want to make a run of 10 or 20? I'll buy 2 right now and see if anybody else is interested. Maybe you can get small handmade runs that way. But I don't know if you'll ever see these stocked in bulk in stores for all the reasons I just word vomited. So speaking of signal converters, Miguel Mariquin asked a question, and I swear I did not read the question before my lengthy reply before. I try to read these questions as I'm answering them for the first time, so you get my real reaction to them. And I honestly didn't know this was going to be the question that followed that. So now I'm glad I just rambled. But anyway, the question is, can you take a signal coming out of an RGB setup from a G-SCART switch and output it to a consumer-grade TV with component input using a SCART to component cable? And as I just described, no, because all you're changing is the connector, not the cable. So, or not the signal, sorry. So what you would actually need is one of the things I described, like the RetroTink SCART to component converter. And I think in your scenario, a really excellent solution would be to take the thing that I just talked about, the SCART coupler, depending on your setup, if you have the room and all that stuff. But for me personally, I would put this SCART coupler in one of the outputs of the G-SCART switch. I would put the RetroTink converter right on top of this, and then use some HD Retrovision cables to go from the component video output of the RGB to comp RetroTink device into your consumer grade TV, because what you're doing there is converting both the connector and the signal. And, I'm talking about that SCART coupler. I'm not selling it or anything, so I'm not trying to upplay something I'm trying to sell here. I just, depending on your setup, it might be easier to take a short 1-foot SCART cable to plug it in, or if you have enough room up top and you have good cable management so you're not putting pressure on that adapter one way or the other, using a coupler might be better. But I prefer the simplicity of things like that. So yes, in your scenario, you have to convert both the signal and the connector, not just the connector. And this stuff's really confusing. By the way, Miguel, I'm certainly not teasing you at all. There's no way to tell these things unless you ask or unless you're familiar, because there's a lot of devices that could take both. So for example, with PlayStation 2, if you have a PlayStation 2 SCART cable going into a new G-SCART switch, the ones from 2019 and later, going into an OSSC and let's say a Sony BVM, and you want to switch between component and RGB, you don't need a different cable. You could output component video through the SCART cable. The G-SCART switch knows what it is, and you could send it out to the OSSC, and the OSSC will understand what the signal is. And same with your BVM. You, of course, on your BVM would have to press the button that switches it over from RGB to component video mode, and same on the OSSC. But that's the opposite solution. This is 3 devices that don't care about the signal. They just need the right connectors on them? So it's an excellent question. It's just one that's really hard to convey sometimes for newcomers. And once again, like, great question, not insulting you at all. I just wanted to put it into context of the things that we were just talking about. So hopefully I clarified that for you, Miguel. Conrad Klaus wanted to know my feelings on what's going to be the best Saturn ODE. So you have the Satiator, Satiator, whatever you want to call it, that's plug and play, no modding required, but there's no price, no release date. The project's been going on for 4 years, and every time there's information on somebody else's ODE, Professor Abracer puts out a lengthy post without a price, release date, or pre-order. So I'm a big fan of his, and I'm going to continue to support his work, but let's just call it like we see it here. Then you have the Fenrir, which, if you have the right model Saturn and you don't need 2-disc support, you could buy that right now. I think the next run of production is coming soon, but you could buy it and use it, and it's a great solution. But it won't work with anything other than a 20-pin Saturn. There's issues with certain board revs at the moment. I'm sure that'll be fixed in an upcoming firmware. And, you know, at the moment, there's no 2-disc support. Or you could pre-order the mode, which is much more expensive, but by the time it's released, it'll be as solid as all of the other Terra Onion ODEs. And if anybody remembers, there were some issues with the SSD S3's video output, but never their ODE. All Terra Onion ODEs have been great. I love the Mega SD, the Neo Geo CD support over their Neo SD Pro AES cart. That's great too. So while, you know, I can't speak for a product I've never touched before, I would think that the mode will release pretty solid. You know, as with any product, there's going to be firmware updates. There's going to be bugs on day one. You know, everybody's only human, but so what's the right one to pick? It's got to be something you got to decide out of all those things that I just kind of flapped on about, which is most important to you. Plug and play with 0 installation. If that's you're able to still use your discs on that, the Satiator. If you just want it now, if you have a compatible Saturn and you just want to start playing right now, your optical drive died, whatever else, then the Fenrir. And if you want to wait to see what the mode has to offer, you could wait for that one, or wait for the SSD support. That's pretty awesome. That way, if you're the type of person that has a full ROM set that you want to leave on your console at all times, it'll actually be cheaper that way. Like a Fenrir and a 2 terabyte micro SD card is going to be way more expensive than a mode and a 2 terabyte SSD. Or maybe not way more expensive, but more expensive. So I would just put all of that into consideration and pick based on your setup and your needs. For me personally, the Satiator, the thought of just a plug and play device, always makes me happy, but how much is it going to be and when can I actually buy one? If it's $300, no, absolutely not. I would rather unbolt my Saturn and swap my drive back in if I needed to do a test on a disc rather than pay that much money for it. And if I can't get it till 2021, like, what's the point? I'd rather just buy a mode now and then deal with it later. But if it's the right price and it's actually going to be available for purchase, before the end of time, then that would be my choice, just because it's a no mod solution. And I think many people out there just don't like modding, even if it's as easy as unbolting and unplugging something. There's always something that can go wrong. How do you know you're not going to pull out the power cable from your Saturn ODE and then, pull too hard and accidentally rip the connector off? And now you're going to have to deal with finding a new connector, soldering that. Like, while most people would be fine, there's always a chance of something going wrong when there's a mod. So, not speaking to performance, not speaking to anything else, just anytime there is a plug and play solution over an installed solution, that's my preference. But, as I said, if it's really expensive and you can't get it, then it doesn't exist at that point anyway. So hopefully I was able to put things into perspective, and everybody's solution will be different, but they all seem to be excellent solutions. Some might need some more time than others, but whatever. I wouldn't call any of them a bad solution. There's just one that might fit your needs better. Bad Reality had a good question, and the skip to the end answer is my ego won't let me. But the actual question is, in the previous Q&A, I've said that I haven't done a follow-up video to the RGBS TV mod because I don't want the liability of beginners shocking themselves. That is one part of it. The question is, would I be open to making the sequel video and only posting it for supporters? In the thought that if somebody supports on any of these platforms, they're already in the know. They already understand at least what I'm trying to do. So, they'll listen a little bit more when it comes to safety than just an average viewer on YouTube that has no idea that CRTs are dangerous. So not shaming that person. It's just, how would you know if you've never heard of it before? And the answer is no for a couple of reasons. First, I've spent so much effort and so much money on equipment to making better quality videos that I don't think I could go back down to just doing a quick, Gonzo style run and gun, here's how you do it type of video. And when I do use even shots of that in other videos, I feel lazy, and I feel like people are going to think less of the video, which is, like I said, my ego. I'm sure that's not true at all. We all have our egos, and we all have the weird little things about them, and that's one of mine. So that's part of it, but the other part is the time. So any time I spend on something takes away from something else. So if I was going to spend 4 or 5 hours just shooting a video about something that takes probably 8 hours start to finish. Because remember, setup, I live in an apartment. I can't just leave something on a bench. So every time I work on something, I got to set up my work area, do everything that needs to be done, shoot the video, do it like live stream style. And what if I'm missing a part? Or a part breaks, then I have to put everything back together and wait for the part to arrive. So at the moment, no, I'd rather just spend the time to make as good of a video as I possibly could with tons of safety warnings and good lighting and all that stuff and explanations and pages on the website to correspond. I'd rather do that. The only exception would be things where there is no setup and tear down, things that I don't think many people would care about, but I'm obsessed with, and there's a lot of those little weird videos on this channel. Or of course, if I ever moved to a real people-sized place where I could have a bench that's empty, that I could leave projects on, where I could do something like that, wait for a part to arrive, then, all I'd have to reset up again is the lighting and the camera, and then finish off the video. So it was a really long explanation. Sorry for getting wordy about that one, but I just wanted to be clear that I don't want to do those run and gun style videos anymore unless I have to, because I just think a lot of people, since so many channels are putting so much effort into their videos, I think a lot of people take it less seriously when you would see 3 or 4 videos of me that are pretty flashy and then one that just looks like me holding a cell phone camera in front of a thing. I don't know. But maybe I'm wrong. By all means, tell me in the comments. Maybe I'm just being stupid. But the space factor is probably the number one thing for that specific video, because I'd have to have something left open probably for at least a few days to a week so I could make sure to get different parts, do different testing and all that stuff. But I would like to. It's on the horizon at some point between now and never. I just got to get a bunch of other stuff done first. Flydeath was following up on the question from last week about a laser phosphor display, basically trying to mimic the look of a CRT using a do-it-yourself type of idea with multiple fisheye lenses and diffusers and stuff like that. And to be honest, that's out of my realm of understanding. I would have to go through that entire research paper, watch the videos, try to build it myself, and even then, it might be out of my skill range. In fact, I would say it probably is outside of my skill range. So if you know anybody working on that project, if you know any of the team members, I would love to do an interview and talk to them on it, but I don't feel comfortable commenting any further than my general overview statement of last week, because I just don't want to spread false information about something that could be totally doable and an awesome project, or vice versa. I don't want to give false hope for something that might not be able to be done outside of proof of concept. So sorry to take the easy, weak way out in this one. I just would rather be honest about it than try to sound smart and just screw everything up. Dave Sobel had a very common question. Dave picked up a set of SCART cables that syncs on the C-Sync pin of the SNES multi-out, and it's working with the SNES, but not the N64. So what that means is whoever modded your console didn't add the C-Sync pin. They probably told you use a Sync-On Luma or Sync-On composite video cable, which are completely reasonable solutions as long as you have a really good shielded one for composite video or just one made for Luma. But that's not always the best way to go about it. And your case is probably the best example. Let's say you have fully shielded cables. You don't have to worry about interference, but you just want to use one cable on everything. It's better to populate the multi-out on any mods to be exactly what you would expect with any connector like that. This goes back to my whole, I won't get into it again, I promise, but that goes back into my, if you're going to mod a console, make sure the output connector always outputs the same exact signal as the original, so you don't have to worry about this. So my suggestion to you is to check out the Retro RGB guide for N64 and see if your board that you used has a pad for C-Sync, and if so, you're able to just move it right over. It's right there in the guide. If not, you could try to do other things like jump the Luma pin over to the C-Sync pin, but you just would want to make sure that there's no signal going to it. So much like the guide that says how to connect the C-Sync signal, it says, hey, if you already have these components, make sure to remove them or cut the trace or something. Follow that. And then the only final thing would be, follow the same thing, make sure there's no signal already going to the pin, make sure it's completely, it's a completely dead pin, and then either add C-Sync from the motherboard to your RGB mod, or just jump the Luma to C-Sync pin, and you'll have Luma down the C-Sync line, but it should work for you. The only scenario that it wouldn't is if you have a device that does not accept anything other than C-Sync. So there's a few RGB monitors, there's Extron switches, but I don't think that's your setup. I think you have a more standard setup than that. You said you're OSSC, so that'll definitely work. Pretty much any SCART switch and an OSSC should be fine. So just give that a shot. And I'm certainly not saying whoever modded it did it wrong. It's just, it's not as complete as it could have been, but it should be a fairly easy solution for you. Doomleg had a question about a consumer-grade Trinitron flat CRT they picked up. It had 2 SCART inputs, S-Video, and composite. That's awesome. The question is, there's a yellow tint to the picture and 1 or 2 spots where the lines aren't straight. Are these things that could be fixed through the hidden service menu, or are these signs of bad caps or miscalibration? So there's a few things about that. Is the yellow tint across the whole picture, or is it only in one spot? If it's across the whole picture, you might be able to fix that using just the main menu, just the tint and color options. And that, it's my opinion. Don't take this as a rule, but it is my opinion that if you have a CRT and you think it could use maintenance, caps, or whatever else, it's perfectly fine to mess with anything in the main menu because those are pretty easy to set back. And in the service menu, basic geometry, so width and height of horizontal and vertical and position, those are things that will probably always need to be tweaked anyway, so go right ahead and mess with any of that and see. But it's also my opinion that once you get past that, if you don't know the condition of the TV, meaning if you're not sure somebody has recently refurbished it, a lot of these things do involve the capacitors, and if you try to calibrate it with them bad, you might not ever get it back to the way it's supposed to be, even after you put the right caps in it. So in your situation, I would mess with anything in the main menu to see if you could fix it, and basic geometry settings. And of course, just write down what the originals were anytime you're in the service menu, and just go from there. And then after that, maybe make it a project. If you're into modding, properly discharge the tube, of course, I gotta say that a million times, and then make yourself a cap list, replace all the capacitors, do it very carefully because you don't want to pull up a trace or anything like that, and then see. But the yellow tint is more bothersome than where the lines aren't straight, because lines aren't straight could be the caps, could need conversion strips, could be just basic geometry settings. But the yellow tint, you want to see if you could fix that and talk to other people with the same model to make sure it's not a problem people know about. I just would hate to have you go through a full refurbishing just to have it still have a yellow tint to it. So maybe talk to people that are familiar. And you said you live in Jerusalem, so if I know anybody in Israel or any Israeli or Palestinian engineers that would help, I have talked to a lot of people actually in that area. So if you're listening now and you're still following the channel, maybe reach out to Doomleg through any of the support services or something, and see if you could help, because if there's techs out there that are already familiar with this, that's certainly an easier thing to deal with. Just throw it in your car and bring it over there. And you said, hope you're hanging in there. Yep, so far so good in New York. I've been staying home and avoiding going out and being around people. And, I've been working at home for so long that the day-to-day stuff is the exact same it's been for a couple of years. It's just, I miss going out and seeing my friends. But as far as the day-to-day stuff goes, it's, business as usual. But thank you for the kind words. Robert Dickinson has a question, and a friend of mine called and asked the same exact question, and I'm going to give you the same answer I gave them. The question is, they have both a GDEMU and a Phoebe, so the Dreamcast optical drive emulator and a Saturn optical drive emulator. After seeing the mode announced, their initial impulse was, wow, pre-order now. But after taking a step back, they're not sure if the mode is going to be an actual upgrade. So, my opinion on stuff like this is, if you already have a solution that you're happy with and it works, wait to see if the next thing is really going to be an upgrade for you. And that's by no means taking a shot at any of these devices at all. This is just basic nerd talk, no emotion. If you have an existing solution and it's working and you don't have any major complaints and there aren't any main things about this new thing that appeal to you, just wait and see and kind of figure it out. And, maybe it's going to release and you'll go, that's really awesome. I love the fact that there's an SSD. I love the menus, but at the end of the day, I'm still playing the exact same games the same way. So it might not be required to upgrade. Or on the other side, you might see it and go, you know what, screw it. That thing's awesome. I'm going to sell what I have and buy that. But strong opinion is always, if you have a solution that's currently working, leave well enough alone until the other thing is out, and then just make your decision based on that. Because, all companies, this is not a shot at anyone, but all companies now are at risk of serious delays and shipping issues and everything else. So while I'm sure that Terra Onion is really doing everything in their power to hit that release date of shipping in late June, there are so many things that are out of everybody's control. So I certainly wouldn't run out, sell your current ODEs and wait for that. I would just kind of leave well enough alone. ABO Hiccups wanted to know if anybody had a good suggestion for aftermarket batteries for the Wii U gamepad. As with anything power related, it's really, really bad if you use the wrong thing or if you use a garbage thing. And I have zero experience with upgrading the Wii U's battery or replacing it. So if anybody watching or listening has any suggestions, or at least knows a good resource for that, please post and let us know. If not, I got nothing to offer, and I apologize. I just haven't gotten to the Wii U yet. I'm still spending so much time on all of these other retro consoles and working on projects and testing. I haven't even really gotten to that yet, so sorry. Bad Reality had some questions about using different types of solder with flux and different applications of it. And I can give some general tips, but I'm not an expert in stuff like this. I know enough to do work that's good enough to share with others, but not the deep chemical makeup of this stuff. So the general info is, if you have solder that has a flux core, is additional flux needed? Could it hurt? And no, as long as you know how to properly clean this stuff up, if it's even needed, then it's not going to hurt to have different kind of flux on there or to add more. Now, people say you shouldn't mix fluxes and things like that, but to be honest, it's, if you're just doing hobby projects for yourself and you're not trying to make your own mod shop and stuff like that, the more flux, the better. Make sure it's thoroughly dried before turning it on. When I say the more flux, the better, I don't mean dip it, you don't pour a cup of it on there or something. But if you're using rosin core solder and it has flux in it, still use some flux with that as well to try to help make the connections, I guess. And that's pretty much it. When you see things that say no clean solder, what that means is after it dries, you don't need to clean it up because it's not going to cause a short, but it still leaves an ugly, sticky film. So I got a clean pen by the same company that I have my solder that I bought the flux with. And when I'm done with something, I use the pen to very carefully kind of clean it. Basically imagine taking a Sharpie, but that cleans instead of writes on it. And then when I'm done with that, then I use an electronics brush, which is essentially a soft toothbrush, and I dump some isopropyl on it and I scrub that all out. And then I, kind of tap it out and then hit it with compressed air. And then depending on what I did, there's some times where things are so dirty that the boards end up being soaked in flux cleaner, and isopropyl that I might leave it in the sun to dry for a few minutes just to get the UV rays in there. It shouldn't be necessary, but I just, when I say leave it out in the sun, I don't mean leave it in a desert baking for hours. I mean, like, leave it in the windowsill after you hit it with the compressed air just to make sure it's dried before you plugged it in. And that's pretty much my overview on that. Experts might disagree. And that's fine. I just know that what I just described isn't harmful. It's as long as you don't plug it in with a wet board. Using too much flux and then cleaning it off is better than not using enough and having cold solder joints. Also, as to when you would use leaded over non-leaded, what the different types of solder applications are, the links I have on my Amazon page and on the tools page were verified by people much smarter than me. This is not a cheap promotion. I'm not trying to get that 5 cents I'm going to get out of your solder purchase or something, but the reason those are there is because people that are smarter than me said, yes, these are good suggestions to use. You could feel comfortable telling people buy that solder, buy that flux, and go from there. If you really had an application though that was specialty, like BGA soldering or soldering super small components that were made from different metals or something, I'm kind of just talking out of my ass on this one, but if you had a specific scenario that you were really worried about that composition, I would spend the time to do the research. But in general, in retro gaming, SNES RGB mods for a SNES Mini or N64, even basic recaps and stuff like that, you don't normally need to worry about all this stuff. Just get yourself non-crappy solder, some good flux, and some decent equipment, and then just clean it up as necessary. Because I do videos, I make sure to clean mine. But if you're just doing it for yourself, having flux, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty confident saying if you just have some flux stains on the board, it looks ugly, but it doesn't hurt anything. And I've seen tons of boards come from the factory still like that. So that's just my opinions and all that stuff. And, sorry I don't have the expertise to talk about the different solder compositions. I just, I don't know enough about it to be confident to tell you the answer to that. Commander Keen wants to know what I think of the Mister's NES core versus the original NES console. Good luck telling the difference as long as your setup is proper. I mean that obviously as a massive compliment. But let me continue your question. Commander Keen's been using the Mister to play a bunch of Mega Man, but can't tell if the input latency is a problem or that I suck at the game. I'm using a Dell computer monitor and a Trinitron hooked up with component cables. I've been thinking about buying the N8 Pro for my stock front loader, but I'm torn about using that towards a blister or buying that separately. So my opinion on this stuff, it's starting to change. And I'm going over this in an upcoming video, so I'm going to give you the short version of this. But my opinion on this is if you love the experience of the nostalgia side, if plugging in that cartridge into an original console and closing the lid and pressing the power button and, if that stuff is important to you, always use original consoles. And to be honest, I appreciate that. It reminds me of happy times and fun experiences. But the reason I play classic games is because I like those games. And I play them equally as much and like them equally as much as brand new games. To me, they're not classic games. They're just games I really like. And if that's the case, all I really care about then is making sure that I use a way to play those games that does not take away from the experience. So for your setup, using a Mister on a consumer grade CRT is perfect. The only thing you might want to make sure of is that you're using a good controller adapter, and you say you're using the RAFnet one, so that should be perfectly fine. I would just check with the Mr. team, just go over on the Discord or something, and double check which USB settings that you want to tweak, because there are things like the blister and the snack that allows you to have the controller adapters and stuff like that. But I believe, in talking to the developers, that you could just get a basic USB controller, try to get one that other people have verified, and just change some of your settings over to change the USB polling down to 1 millisecond. And now you have 1 millisecond of latency, which is imperceptible. The best Tetris players in the world couldn't tell 1 millisecond. The best fighting game players in the world can't. And if they say they can, they're just using it as an excuse because they lost to a player that was better than them. I might get my ass kicked for saying that, but it is absolutely the truth. You cannot be able to tell 1 millisecond of lag in almost every case. There's a few weird, not applicable to this scenarios in which we might want to have a fun discussion about someday, but just playing NES games, I can't imagine 1 millisecond would ever make a difference. So, the overall answer is decide what's more important to you. The overall experience, there's nothing wrong with that, or just the games. And if it's just about the games, a Mister hooked up to your, consumer grade CRT, especially with component cables, that's really good quality, with a good controller solution, is going to be about as good as it gets. And the only thing you would really add to that with original hardware is the look and feel of original hardware. For me personally, because I'm changing my setup so often because of testing, I have my consoles kind of sorted, displayed, but not plugged in. So if I need to use them now, I could just easily grab them off the shelf. But I have been gaming more on the Mister than original consoles. So it's kind of funny. Like, I still have in view my setup of original consoles, and I'm still playing with whatever original controller I wanted to use, but it's all going through the Mister. So hopefully that puts it into decent perspective for you. Lewis F96 wanted to know if I heard anything from Mike Chi about the Neo Geo Rad2X losing signal when white flashes occur. They returned theirs to Retro Gaming Cables, and they didn't know what the problem was. I talked to Mike, and he said he hadn't had time to test it yet. I don't think there's been a lot of complaints of that, so my gut feeling is still a weird revision of the AES. That is not a good solution for you right now. I understand that, and I apologize, but I would like to figure this out for myself, just out of curiosity. It could be fixed with some kind of firmware update that tweaks the tolerances in being more forgiving for the Neo Geo. But I think it's more important to figure out why this is happening, and if it's an issue with the Neo Geos, it's probably a good idea to look into an RGB bypass or something like that. So, and those aren't complicated or too expensive or anything, but if I do hear anything, I'll try to do a little video or at least a post on it or something like that. So, sorry there's no update. Joe Paley is having issues running an RGB Pi through a G-SCART switch. When going directly into an RGB monitor, it works fine, but when run through the G-SCART switch, the display is green, garbled, and unstable, and all the other consoles work fine, so it's not like a bad port in the G-SCART switch or something. So I remember this happening, and I don't remember what the solution or actual cause was, and I apologize. I probably should have recorded this somewhere. I can't remember if it was a specific revision of either, if it was a software revision, but I definitely remember seeing it. Now, the one problem I do often run into is the sync output of the RGB Pi through like an A-series BVM. Those are the ones that are completely the least compatible RGB monitors I've ever used, pretty much. So the D9H, the D14H, and then any of the A series with the BKM68X. And my RGB Pi doesn't work with those. It has the same thing that you described. So that means that the issue has to be sync related. So depending on your G-SCART switch, try turning sync stripping on or off. Try sync regeneration on or off. Try, if it's an older switch, put it in the port that's closest to the outputs and see if that makes a difference. If it's any of the newer ones, that's not going to make a difference. But I honestly don't remember exactly what that was. So I would just try the things that I suggested first, and then possibly reach out to the RGB Pi team, who are all very friendly. So maybe that's something they've run into before, but I'm pretty sure it's something to do with the sync signal itself. So if you wouldn't mind, give those a try and definitely let me know, because because I'm kind of curious as to what that was, and I'm a little embarrassed that I'm completely drawing a blank here. But I do work on these things all day, every day for years now, so some stuff just escapes me. Rob R. wants to know if there's been any new developments in the world of N64, HDMI, or RGB. So the Ultra HDMI is always impossible to find, and it is an excellent choice. And the RGB mods are all still readily available, I believe. So there's the basic boards for the models of N64 that are compatible with it, which just adds RGB and it works perfect. And then, of course, there's the models that require the more advanced boards. And those boards also offer extra features. So the one from Tim and the more medium one from Bordy, they both offer deblur options and a bunch of other cool, like 15-bit mode and other stuff. And then Bordy's advanced one also could do things like 480p, component video out. It's pretty cool, actually. But to be honest, my opinion on this has changed. And it might change again, which is why I haven't made like an official video on it. When I first got the Ultra HDMI, I was just blown away at how sharp it could be. I loved all of the deblur stuff in it. It was a different way to see N64 games altogether. But after spending some time with it, and after spending some time with the more basic options, I've actually found that the way 480p on my OLED and even on my really cheap LG LCD TV, the way 480p looks stretched to the native display of 4K looks or translates really well to the N64. I've also found that the RetroTink line of products, which includes, of course, the Rad2X, that smoothing filter works really well with the N64 to the point where if I had a choice between using RGB and composite with a Rad2X, I would definitely still choose RGB, but I wouldn't be upset at the composite video. Because of the way the N64's composite video signal is generated, it's not as noisy as other consoles. But I think I've started to really appreciate why Nintendo added all of that blurring and anti-aliasing. Because depending on how you use it, yeah, it could look a little speckled and noisy. But if you use it in the context of the smoothing filter and then 480p stretched to 4K, which is another, it's not integer on TV, so it's another kind of way of smoothing things out. It kind of fakes it to look like a higher resolution signal, so you don't get the sharpness, but you don't also get that boxy look, which I prefer for 2D games, but not for 3D games like what you'd predominantly find on N64. So it's just kind of a weird perspective on all that. I think first of all, the bottom line is whatever your eyes prefer is the right answer. But when using N64, that's definitely been my preference. And as odd as this might sound, I think I prefer RGB through a Rad2X or the RetroTink products into with the filter on over an Ultra HDMI. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of the N64. I mainly just use it when I'm testing. But I shot the Nintendo episode of the Rad2X, but I haven't released it yet because they're still held up because of everything going on in the world. And in shooting that episode is really what changed my mind, because I spent a lot of time staring at this, and I just thought, this is actually pretty impressive. So to answer your question, have there been any new developments? No, but I took a different look at the existing ones, and I really think that any RGB output through any of the devices that have the filters, Rad2X, RetroTink 2X, I think is my favorite way at the moment. My opinions do change though, so who knows? But that's definitely what I prefer for now. And I don't know of any groups working on alternatives. Other than just silly little proof of concept stuff. And if it does ever turn into a product, it's not going to be soon. It's not going to be months away. It would be a year away. And I don't even know if those things would offer a different experience. So if you're looking, I guess the shortest way to put it is if you're looking to get into N64 on a flat screen right now, grab a RetroTink 2X and either an S-Video cable, or if you have an RGB mod, then an RGB cable, or component, whatever else, and kind of just go from there, because I think you'd be pretty happy with the results. But there's a group of people out there that really prefer the options of the Ultra HDMI and the different ways of manipulating the image that way. And of course, streamers, I imagine, too, would really prefer that, because you could just have the image whatever way you would want it. But So no, there really aren't any differences, but take a different look at what is already out there. Kyle Lenhart is looking for a good quality JAMA extender cable. Does anybody know of a good one? Yeah, there's two. The creator of the Hass is making his own, and I believe the same person that made the minigun made their own open source one that you could either just make or other people are manufacturing them. And they're both exactly what you would want. They're quality extenders that I don't believe reduces the quality at all. But, in a situation where you don't want to stick the minigun or the Hass directly onto your arcade board, maybe there's not enough room for it to sit properly. Yeah, these are absolutely perfect. And there's even certain arcade boards and cases where it's kind of hard to get these super guns plugged directly in, so you would just want a basic ribbon cable style. So just search Retro RGB for JAMA and both will come up, and I'm pretty sure you could at least order one of them right now, and the other one you could buy the parts and make your own, and other people might still be selling them too. Matt Richtenberg said they'd like to hook up a PS3 to a Sony VGA monitor at 720p. By the way, did I get your name right? So the monitor's 4x3, but it'll only display 4x3 resolutions like 1280 by 960. Is there any way to get 720p displayed 1:1? No. And there's a few things to think about here, though. So the PlayStation 3 will only output TV resolutions. So in your case, 480i won't work. So 480p, 4x3, or 16:9. And then 720p, 1080i, and 1080p are all widescreen resolutions. And I don't believe the PS3 has the ability at all to output PC resolutions. So what you might want to do is just go 480p, 4x3. With CRTs, you will notice a difference in resolution, but it's not going to be as drastic as a flat screen. So depending on the game, that might work better. So here's an example. The PS3 and Xbox 360 version of Daytona USA are pretty much the best you can get, and they're my favorites to play mostly, but they're only in 16:9. So even if you set your PS3 to 4x3, 480p, the menus are in 4x3, it boots in 4x3, but the moment you start the game plays letterboxed. So in that case, I would set it to 720p and just play it that way. But Mortal Kombat, the complete edition, will play in a native 4x3 mode. So I would set that to 480p and let it fill the whole screen natively. Just my opinions, though. I also think that if you game in 480p, if your goal is CRT gaming, 480p is a perfectly good resolution. It kind of gives you that Dreamcasty retro look too. It's all preference, of course, but that's definitely what I would try. And the only other thing to add is a very good solution is HDMI to VGA adapters. But some don't like the PS3 and some do. And I think that has to do with the weird HDCP stuff going on with it. So that 10DAC one was one that I've been using that seemed to work fine. Some people have complained about that, but I think that's a very specific use case where that causes issues. Just make sure to set your PS3 setting properly. You want the full black levels output and all that stuff. Going from HDMI to VGA with that adapter, I would mostly try to go with 480p 4x3 and then only switch to 720p for games that are widescreen only. Just my opinion, so maybe it'll point you in the right direction. Baba Yaga wants to know if there's a way to get S-Video or composite out of a Mister. What's the best option and the most affordable solution? And this makes sense because a lot of people can find really good condition consumer grade CRTs with either S-Video or composite input. And in my opinion, S-Video still looks absolutely spectacular. So, either one is great. If you use composite video, you get to enjoy the composite blending the artists who made the games implemented into it. If you use S-Video, it's really close to an RGB solution, so you get some sharpness. And the best answer I have for you is to wait to see if the adapter that Mike Chi just designed will work and be compatible with the Mister in its current form. It might need a quick hardware revision, it might need a special cable or something, but I will be getting one into test, and that is exactly what I would test on it, which is basically going to be SCART output to it'll output via either a D-sub connector, and it'll also encode S-video and composite from that signal. So I'll test it as soon as it gets in. That means you'll need to somehow start with a SCART output. So you probably would want to get one of the Mr. I/O boards and then one of the SCART cables made for it, and then kind of just go from there. And I believe this will allow for dual output as well, but I'll test it when it gets in. And your question of somebody who has a Mister and one of these TVs has your old adapter for S-video and composite, but they get no picture at all. So you would need to be specific about what your old adapter was, but if you just mean a VGA to S-video or VGA to composite cable, that will not work because that's only changing the connector. It's still waiting for the Mister to generate those signals, which I don't believe they do for any of the cores, at least as of yet. And that would work on like the analog DAC or the analog NT Mini, but that's a completely different device that has had those signals programmed in. So if that's the situation you're talking about, it's not going to work that way. But just hang tight. I'll test Mike's adapter as soon as it comes in, and I'll let everybody know. 8% Android said they're looking to get their Saturn modded and serviced, and was wondering if anyone had any good experiences of companies based in the UK. Was looking at Video Game Perfection, and they look great, but mods are undertaken in Greece, and I'm not sure I want to deal with the shipping with everything going on at the moment. Yeah, totally understandable. I believe 8-Bit Mods is out of the UK. I could be wrong. I apologize if I am. No disrespect to anybody. And I don't know if they offer directly Saturn services, but it's worth contacting them. And, depending on how much money you want to spend and what you're looking to get done, I definitely recommend the FRAM mod. And, if you're going to spend the money and ship your console out, maybe consider having it recapped. I have not had a problem with any of my personal Saturns or anybody else's with capacitors, but I've had friends tell me that they've run into issues with that before. So, if you have the cash at the moment to do so and you're going to send one in for modding anyway, those are definitely the two mods that I would prefer or that I would suggest. And a BIOS mod depending on your use case. So if you're going to be using original discs and you're going to be using multi-region discs, then a BIOS mod is probably a good idea. If you have a mod chip in there to play CDRs and backups, then you don't need a BIOS because you could just use the patching tools to do so. And if you're going to be using an optical drive emulator, same thing. You could just use games from all regions. So just my thoughts on all that. But yeah, look into 8-Bit Mods and see if they'll take care of it for you. AJ Habrack had a few questions. First, they want to know if I'd been in contact with the Blake Spiderwaffle BVM and PVM technician guy. No. After that interview, he dropped off the planet. I think I'd sent him a bunch of emails. He'd promised to sell me a monitor or two, and I think I may have heard once, and that was it. He disappeared. So I don't know what's up with that guy. He genuinely seemed like he was trying his best. I know people had issues with him a few years prior to that, but everybody I know that had bought something from him within 6 months to a year of that interview had nothing but good things to say. He seemed like he was doing his best, and then he just disappeared. So I hope he's doing well. I wish him the best. Don't know what his issue is, but hopefully he gets it sorted out. Also, you said you got burned on your last PVM on eBay. Luckily, you were able to get your money back, but you'd rather not deal with a headache again. I'm so glad that you were able to get your money back. It always makes me sad when I hear about bad situations for either the seller or the buyer, to be honest with you. As long as good people are involved, I guess. But if you're looking for like a no contact buy right now, I think eBay still might be your best bet. And it just comes down to communication, I guess, which is unfair a little bit because I know people that are awesome technicians, really good people, know how to ship a monitor. They're just really bad at communicating. So if I were in that situation, like I bought a monitor that I talked about on the podcast, I believe, that was in awesome condition. It arrived immaculately packed. I'm very happy with the purchase overall. And the reason I felt comfortable with that is because I just had a basic conversation with the person selling it. I wasn't unreasonable. There wasn't 1,000 emails and demands and stuff. It was just a conversation, and you could tell that if they were making any of this stuff up, they're an insanely good liar, so it was worth rolling the dice, especially knowing that, as you've learned, eBay will almost always side with a buyer which kind of sucks for sellers that get taken advantage of. But no, my experience was amazing, start to finish. So you could still kind of keep your eyes open on eBay if you're willing to go through that again. If not, maybe contact me. I might, depending on where you live, I might be able to put you in touch with somebody close to you. And the only other suggestion for people looking to get into PVMs or any kind of CRT monitors is don't discount the ones that are missing RGB inputs, because the difference between composite and S-Video is much bigger than the difference between S-Video and RGB in many cases. I mean, there's sometimes you'd be able to tell the difference, but overall, if I had 3 identical monitors sitting next to each other and one was playing composite, one was S-Video, and one was RGB, you'd really be able to see the difference between the left 2, composite and S-Video, and you'd still be able to see the difference between RGB and S-Video, but it's not as drastic. So maybe just, even if it's temporary, consider getting yourself any PVM at all, even if it only has composite and S-Video inputs. I think a perfectly good solution is having a full RGB setup with a G-SCART switch going into an OSSC, and then the second output of the G-SCART going into that device that Mike's designing that converts RGB to S-Video. I think that might be a perfectly good solution, and it might be the best of both worlds. So don't discount S-Video monitors if you could find them. And also, you said, sorry if this is the wrong place to ask this. Ask anything at all anybody wants. This is, it's completely open for any questions. I try my best to answer them. So, hopefully I was able to get you pointed in the right direction. And let me know where you live, and I might be able to introduce you to somebody local that might have something stashed away. Blue Rigel 81 has an interesting question involving their setup. And I do have an opinion on it, but I do want to make sure I'm clear that this is just my opinion. There is no right answer for this. Everybody's setup's different, but enough rambling. So the issue is they have a Super NT and a retro USB AVS that they use to play original cartridges over HDMI. They also currently have a Genesis and a 32X that they run through a RetroTink 2X. And that's how they get those consoles on HDMI. They're considering getting an analog Mega SG and the DAC for 32X support. So they want to know if it's a worthwhile quality boost in doing it that way. So there are 2 factors in this. The first factor is Model 1 Genesis quality and then 32X video quality. So if you're lucky enough to have a Model 1 Genesis that's already very sharp, then you should be good to go. However, when you're going through the RetroTink 2X, you're doubling to 480p, so it's not the sharpest resolution. So your average experience with a Model 1 Genesis and a RetroTink 2X is going to be pretty good, because you're not going to see the jail bars that you would going like 5X on an OSSC. The question would then be, though, if you get an analog Mega SG and an analog DAC, are you going to notice a difference in 32X? So then, and I'm sorry, I know this is confusing for people that aren't fully aware of this setup. I'm sure Blue Rigel knows what I'm talking about, but you have to kind of visualize that the 32X in this setup can only be used analog output. There is no HDMI output for the 32X. So regardless of if you're using your Model 1 Genesis or analog Mega SG, if you use the 32X, you still need its analog video output. So you would get pretty much the same quality using the Mega SG, DAC, and 32X through a RetroTink 2X that you would just the original console. However, the actual output of the Mega SG, just the Genesis part, not the 32X. So if you're just playing like a Sonic the Hedgehog cartridge, that is going to be a noticeable difference in sharpness over an original console and a RetroTink. And of course, it should be. You're paying for a high quality solution. So my opinion is that I would get an analog Mega SG for Genesis, but then use your original setup for 32X. And, you could save some money. You don't need to buy the DAC. You don't need to buy the riser. You don't need to buy the custom cables. And it's going to be about the same quality for 32X. However, you would still get all of the advantages of the Mega SG. Original cartridges, direct HDMI output. So just my opinion. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but if I were you, I would leave your original hardware setup through a RetroTink as the 32X option, and then everything else through the Mega SG. So hopefully I didn't get overly confusing for people that don't own that equipment and don't really grasp why this is so complicated. But I think anybody that owns a DAC or has done some research probably knows what I mean. So hopefully I didn't sound like a moron in that one. Well, that's it for this week. As always, thanks so much to everybody that participates in these. I hope they're a help and at least mildly entertaining. I hope I don't ramble too much for some of this stuff. And if you're new to all this, if you're a supporter and you have a question, ask in the latest Q&A post wherever it is that you support. The way the services work, there isn't like a general comments thing, so I can't go through and just pick out every new comment. So it really is best to just ask your question in the latest Q&A post, and then I'll get to it the next week. And also, I mean this very respectfully, but I don't check any of the comments on the YouTube side because this is just a thank you and an interaction with people that are on the support services. I have answered thousands of questions over the years on all other YouTube videos and try my best to do so. But this one is just a thank you and a shout out to all of the supporters. So if you have the ability to support and you enjoy these, maybe consider signing up. If not, it's totally cool too. They're still free for everybody to listen to. They usually go live a week afterwards, but the next time I skip a week for whatever reason, they're all just going to come out on the same day. But anyway, as always, thank you all so much for your support. It's what's keeping all of this cool research and development stuff going. So thank you again, and I'll see you next week.